The first sound was not a roar, but a broken rasp, a sound too soft for a predator, too desperate for the wild. From the edge of the thorn scrub, the man looked up. A lioness was limping toward him, her coat streaked with dust and the pale shimmer of dried blood. Between her jaws, barely breathing, hung a cub no larger than a house cat. She staggered forward, every step shaking with exhaustion. The man didn't move. Years of working in wildlife rehabilitation had taught him that stillness could mean survival, for both sides. The lioness's eyes met his for a long, trembling second. Then she laid the cub at his feet. The cub's sides rose weakly, one uneven breath after another. Its small paws twitched, its ribs sharp as reeds beneath the fur. The lioness let out a low moan, a sound of something deeper than pain. The man crouched slowly, keeping his movements minimal, his breath quiet. "It's okay," he whispered, the words meant more for rhythm than meaning. The lioness didn't flinch. He saw the cause, deep punctures along the cub's hind leg, likely from a failed attempt at moving through a thorn fence or a rival's attack. The infection had set in, the smell of decay rode faintly on the dry air. For minutes, the lioness simply stood there, chest heaving. Her muscles quivered under the strain. Behind her, vultures traced slow circles in the sky. He could feel her strength fading, but also her will, still fierce beneath the trembling. The man reached for his field satchel. Every instinct told him to let nature take its course, but something in the lioness's behavior defied logic. Wild mothers never brought their young to humans. Yet here she was, not attacking, not retreating, just waiting. He cleaned the wound with gentle precision, wrapping the cub's leg with gauze. The cub whimpered, then fell silent. The lioness lowered her head, touching her nose briefly to the cub's flank, an ancient gesture of reassurance. Then she looked at the man once more, her gaze steady, unreadable. He spoke again, almost under his breath. "You did what you could." Moments later, her legs buckled. She sank slowly onto the earth, her body rising and falling with heavy breaths. The cub stirred weakly beside her. The man backed away, knowing that any sudden move might break the fragile truce between them. For nearly an hour, she stayed that way, unmoving except for the faint rhythm of breath and tail flick. When twilight began to spill across the plains, the cub opened its eyes. It let out a faint cry, thin but alive. The lioness lifted her head, a flicker of strength returning. That sound, the cub's call, carried across the dry air, echoing off the rocks like a promise. The man felt the weight of it settle deep in his chest. He knew he would never be able to explain this moment in data or reports. When the night came, the lioness rose again. Her steps were unsteady, but deliberate. She nudged her cub once, twice, then gathered it gently between her jaws. Before disappearing into the darkness, she paused, a silent glance backward, brief as breath, and then she was gone. The next morning, the scientists found traces near the waterhole, 2 sets of paw prints, side by side. None of them could explain how the cub had survived the night. But every one of them understood that something extraordinary had passed between the wild and the human, a quiet act of trust that no study could ever measure. And when the sun rose again over the golden grasslands, it felt, just for a moment, as if the earth itself had witnessed mercy. 3 days passed before the savannah spoke again. The heat had grown heavier, thick with the hum of insects and the smell of dry grass. The man kept to his quiet routine, checking camera traps, logging tracks, watching the watering hole through binoculars. Yet every time the wind shifted, he turned, half expecting to see a golden figure in the dust. At dusk on the 4th day, a sound rolled across the plains, low, uneven, and carried by the wind. A lion's call, but not the commanding kind that claimed territory. It was broken, searching. He froze. The call came again, closer this time. When he stepped beyond the edge of the camp, he saw her, the same lioness, thinner now, her fur dull beneath the fading sun. And behind her, unsteady but alive, the small cub limped forward. For a long moment, the man could only stare. The cub's leg was scarred but healed enough for walking. Each step wobbled, yet determination burned in its small frame. The lioness moved slower than before, her ribs faintly visible, but her head was high. She stopped just beyond the boundary of the camp. The cub sank beside her, pressing into her flank. The man didn't move closer. He simply watched, breath shallow, heart echoing with disbelief. No one had ever documented a wild lion returning voluntarily to a human after an encounter like this. Scientists would later argue about scent familiarity, spatial memory, or maternal recognition, but none of those explanations could account for what happened next. The lioness lay down, eyes fixed on the man. Between them stretched a quiet distance of respect, the kind only earned once. He crouched slowly and whispered, "You made it." The cub lifted its head, ears twitching at the sound. For a moment, it seemed to study him, not with fear, but with a kind of innocent curiosity. Then, without warning, the lioness nudged the cub forward, just one small push of her nose. The gesture was unmistakable: trust. The man stayed still as the cub hobbled closer, its paw dragging slightly over the dust. When it reached the edge of his shadow, it stopped, blinked, and let out a faint rumble, the smallest echo of a roar. He smiled, barely breathing. "You're safe now." Behind them, the savannah stirred, the wind brushing through dry acacia branches, the faint hoot of an owl beginning its evening hunt. Nature continued, indifferent yet encompassing. After a while, the lioness stood again. She gave a low call, and the cub turned, obedient and slow. Together, they began walking toward the open grasslands. The man didn't follow. He knew the wild had reclaimed what was never his to keep. But when he looked down, he noticed something near his boot, a single tuft of golden fur, caught on a thorn branch. He picked it up, turning it between his fingers as the last light burned orange across the sky. That night, the camp remained unusually quiet. He wrote a single line in his logbook before closing it: "The lioness returned, not for help, but for acknowledgement." Weeks later, when researchers reviewed motion footage from the distant cameras, they found something that defied explanation. At dawn, near the far edge of the reserve, the lioness was seen resting beneath a tree, the cub beside her, stronger now, playfully pawing at her tail. But just before she stood to leave, she lifted her head toward the horizon, toward the direction of the man's camp, and held her gaze there for several long seconds. The scientists paused the video at that frame countless times, debating instinct, coincidence, and memory. But for the man who had met her eyes, no argument mattered. He knew what he had seen, and what she had given: a silent return, a gesture beyond words, and the quiet proof that even in the fiercest wild hearts, gratitude can find its voice. The rains had not yet come. Dust rose in soft clouds under every step, clinging to boots, fur, and leaves alike. The man walked slowly along the cracked riverbed, recording animal tracks etched into the mud like fragile memories. It had been nearly 2 months since the lioness's return. No one had seen her since. Only traces, paw marks near the northern ridge, faint impressions of a smaller set beside them, told the story that she still roamed somewhere in the wilderness. The camp had grown quiet in her absence. Some of the younger researchers believed she'd moved on, or perhaps fallen to the struggles of the dry season. But the man couldn't bring himself to believe that. The wild didn't erase bonds so easily. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, he heard it again, a distant roar. Not the call of dominance, but one of presence, carried low and even across the plains. He stopped his work, the notebook falling loosely at his side. The sound came again, answered faintly by another, smaller, lighter, uncertain. He followed the direction until the acacia thinned. Beyond the ridgeline, he found them. The lioness stood beneath a fallen tree, her fur brighter now, her muscles restored. At her side, the cub, no longer limping, practiced its stance, crouching and pouncing on insects that vanished in small bursts of dust. The sight was both ordinary and astonishing. He stayed hidden, watching silently. Every movement of the cub echoed her, the tilt of the head, the timing of its breaths. She had taught it well. A soft breeze passed through the dry grass, and for a moment, the lioness lifted her gaze. Her eyes caught the faint shimmer of light where the man stood. She didn't growl, didn't turn away. Instead, she held his gaze, steady, calm, knowing. Then she did something he hadn't expected. She stepped aside, revealing a small, half-buried carcass of a springbok, fresh, untouched. The cub looked up at her, then toward the man's direction, as if waiting for a cue. The lioness nudged her young one gently toward the meal, letting it take the first bite. He realized, in that quiet instant, that this was her message, not one of need or weakness, but of teaching. She was showing him what survival looked like, how the cub he once saved had learned to live. The man whispered, barely audible, "You did it." The lioness's ears flicked. A faint sound escaped her throat, not a growl, but a low rumble of acknowledgement. Then, with a fluid motion, she turned, her tail brushing lightly over the cub's back. They began to walk away, side by side, disappearing into the tall grass that shimmered gold under the sinking sun. He didn't follow. Some moments belonged to memory more than to sight. Back at camp, the others gathered around his camera footage. They spoke in hushed voices about the cub's strength, the lioness's recovery, and the strange familiarity of her behavior. One of the scientists murmured, "It's like she wanted him to see." Weeks later, when the rains finally broke, the man stood by the river's edge, watching the first storm darken the horizon. The scent of wet earth filled the air, heavy and alive. Across the plain, distant roars echoed again, deeper now, belonging not just to two lions, but to many. A pride had formed. He smiled quietly, closing his eyes as thunder rolled in the distance. He knew he might never see them again, yet something of that wild bond had settled within him, a sound, a memory, an unspoken thread between their worlds. When the lightning flashed across the savannah, he thought he saw them one last time, a lioness and her grown cub standing together on the ridge, framed by rain and light. Then the moment passed, carried away by the storm, but its echo remained, as eternal as the wild itself. The rains had reshaped everything. Grass now swayed knee-high, painted in shades of green so vivid it seemed unreal. Herds moved freely again, antelope bounding across soaked soil, elephants trailing mud behind them like shadows. The man stood beneath a wide marula tree, his camera slung loosely around his shoulder, listening to the rhythm of water dripping from the leaves. Months had passed since his last sighting of the lioness. Reports from nearby researchers told of a small pride forming near the northern ridge, a mature female, her growing cub, and two younger lions recently seen hunting together. Every description matched her. But no one had seen her up close since the rains began. He wasn't sure what had drawn him back to this exact place, the same patch of land where she had once collapsed, her cub barely breathing beside her. The ground was softer now, wildflowers pushing through the mud. The air held a scent of renewal. He crouched, running his fingers over the soil where her paw prints had once been. The memory rose with such clarity that he could almost hear her breath again, rough but determined. A faint rustle interrupted his thoughts. The grass shifted about 30 meters away. He turned slowly. A shape emerged, golden, fluid, familiar. The lioness stepped into view, her body sleek and powerful once more. At her side, the cub, now nearly grown, muscles lean under its maturing frame, followed closely. It was no longer the fragile creature he had once held in his hands, it moved with the confidence of its kind. For a long time, none of them moved. The distance between man and wild was filled only with the soft hum of insects and the distant rumble of thunder. She came no closer. She didn't need to. Her presence alone carried meaning, an acknowledgement, perhaps, or a farewell. The man lowered his gaze in quiet respect. "You remember," he murmured. The lioness blinked once, slow and deliberate. Then, in a motion both fierce and graceful, she brushed her head gently against her cub's shoulder, urging it forward. The younger lion stepped ahead, just a few cautious paces, and looked toward the man. Its amber eyes were curious, unafraid. He felt the weight of the moment, not fear, not pride, but something deeper, connection. He knew she was teaching it again. This time, not survival, but trust. Rain began to fall in thin threads, soft at first, then steady. The lioness turned, guiding her cub toward the rising hills. Their shapes moved through the curtain of rain like ghosts of golden light. He stood there long after they were gone, the sound of rain merging with the low pulse of thunder. Around him, the plains shimmered with new life, wildebeest grazing, birds darting between trees, the air vibrating with rebirth. Later, as he returned to camp, the others listened to his account in silence. One of them asked softly, "Do you think she knew you were there?" He thought for a long time before answering. "I think she wanted me to see what she'd become." That night, as rain tapped gently against the tent, he opened his old field log. On the first page, the words from months ago still stood. The lioness returned, not for help, but for acknowledgement. He turned the page and added a new line beneath it. She came back again, not to ask, not to thank, but to remind us that compassion leaves a mark the wild never forgets. When dawn came, the savannah glowed under a sheet of mist. The air smelled of wet soil and blooming life. Somewhere far beyond the ridge, a lion's deep call rose, steady, unbroken, carrying through the valley. The man smiled, listening. It was not a cry for help this time. It was the sound of continuation, the circle closing and beginning again. The savannah had changed, and yet it hadn't. The man, older now, walked slower through the tall grass, his steps careful, deliberate. The wind still carried the same dry hum, the same scent of dust and heat, and somewhere far off, the distant echo of lions at dusk. Time had weathered both him and this land, but neither had forgotten the other. He paused near the acacia ridge where it had all begun. The old research camp was gone now, reclaimed by roots and wind. What remained were faint traces, the stone foundation of a storage hut, a few rusted tools, and the path that once led to the watering hole. He lowered his satchel and sat on a rock, watching herds of impala flicker in the distance. A sense of peace settled over him, tinged with something older than memory, the quiet understanding that he was only passing through while the land endured. Then, as the sun began to tilt toward the horizon, movement caught his eye. From between the grass emerged a lion, massive, golden, with a menere still touched by youth's vibrancy. Its stride was measured, unhurried, confident. Scars laced its flank in faint white lines, like stories carved by survival. The man's heart stilled. There was no mistaking it, the eyes were the same. Amber and deep, carrying that strange intelligence he had once seen in a fragile cub's gaze. The lion stopped a short distance away, head slightly tilted, studying him. The man didn't reach for his camera or binoculars. He simply sat, breathing quietly, letting the moment unfold. They watched each other in silence. The air shimmered with heat, and cicadas sang somewhere unseen. The lion's tail flicked once, twice, then stilled. A low rumble rose from its chest, not a threat, but a sound of recognition, soft and low, like an echo from years long gone. He whispered, "You made it." The lion blinked slowly, then did something unexpected. It stepped closer, not aggressively, but with the calm certainty of a creature that had nothing to fear. It stopped just a few meters away, lowering its head slightly, eyes steady. For one timeless breath, man and lion shared the same silence. No barrier, no fear, just the thin thread of memory stretching across years and instinct. Then, as if satisfied, the lion turned. From the tall grass behind it, two smaller figures emerged, cubs, still clumsy, still learning how to walk the world. They bounded after the adult, one tripping over its own paws. The lion gave a quiet grunt, herding them gently toward the setting sun. The man felt a warmth rise in his chest, pride, awe, gratitude. The circle was complete. He watched them disappear into the horizon, their shapes swallowed by the light until only the whisper of their movement remained. The savannah was quiet again, save for the wind brushing through the reeds. He stayed there long after darkness fell, the stars spreading wide above him like silver dust. When he finally opened his old logbook, its pages brittle with time, he found the first line he had ever written about her: "The lioness brought her dying cub to a man." He smiled faintly, then added the last words he would ever write in it, "And through her trust, the wild remembered him." As dawn crept across the plains, the sky blushed with gold. Far away, a lion's call rose once more, strong, enduring, eternal. The man closed his eyes and listened. He didn't need to see them again. He knew the bond remained, carried not in words, but in the living pulse of the wild itself.